The void stretched before me, blacker than the absence of hope, punctured only by distant, indifferent stars. From the bridge of the void ship I felt the pulse of the cosmos, the imperceptible tremor of planets unseen, and the whispers of a galaxy steeped in endless war. Imagine a figure, cloaked in shadows, whose mastery over the Force could bend stars and minds alike, stepping into the Imperium's labyrinthine expanse. Entire worlds would tremble beneath a power they cannot comprehend. The Adeptus Custodes, the legions of the Astra Militarum, and even the silent, eternal Necron tombships might find themselves caught in the web of a new architect of chaos, yet not chaos in the traditional sense. Sidious would not simply destroy. He would ensnare, manipulate, and twist the very sinews of the galaxy, turning faith into fear, loyalty into obsession, and the shining light of Terra into a beacon for shadows. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I look into this endless void and I see that 99% of you wander these stories but never swear your allegiance. If you stand with me among these tales of war, faith, and fire, then subscribe. It means more than you know. It helps these chronicles of the Imperium reach others who still remember what humanity once was. And tell me, from which world, hive, or system do you watch? I always read your messages. It reminds me that even across the stars, the spirit of mankind still listens. The galaxy is vast, incomprehensible, and unforgiving. What follows is not mere speculation. It is a journey through shadowed corridors of possibility, a chronicle of what might be should an agent of unparalleled cunning and sorcery stride into the heart of the Imperium. This is a story of survival and ambition, of whispered prayers and apocalyptic confrontations, where the very nature of faith, power, and reality bends under the weight of one being's will. The sky above Cadia was a bleeding canvas of fire and ash. Orbital bombardments tore at the fortress world's surface with relentless precision, each promethium-laced explosion sending columns of smoke and ruin skyward. Trenches and Spartan fortifications trembled beneath the fury, shivering with the resonance of distant void cannons. Soldiers, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, moved through the chaos like shadows themselves, clutching bolters as if mere iron and ceramic could stave off the void that encroached. Even the air reeked of despair, metal, ozone, scorched earth, a scent that lingered in the lungs and on the mind. I followed the movements of a platoon through shattered alleys, their vox grills crackling with frantic reports. 3rd Regiment holding Sector 7, casualties rising. Cannot sustain, the static cut the voice short, leaving only the hollow echo of fear. Children hidden in the Undercity screamed at the distant rumble, their prayers half formed to the Emperor, half formed to nothing at all. Everywhere there were ghosts, the pale outlines of men and women pressed into servitude, eyes wide with exhaustion and terror, clutching at each other, afraid to let go lest the darkness claim them entirely. Cadia was burning, and yet its people fought, stubborn and broken, clinging to the thin thread of hope that someone somewhere still remembered the face of humanity. Then he appeared, not a roar of engines, not the stench of promethium fire. He moved like thought itself, a shadow folding in upon the world. To call him dark would be inadequate, for his presence seemed to pull the very color from the air, leaving a weightless gray that pressed down upon the mind. Soldiers felt it instinctively, a dissonance in their bones, a whisper in the recesses of memory that did not belong to Cadia, to the Imperium, or even to any known warp phenomenon. Some cried out, others fell to their knees, hands pressed to their faces as though shielding against an invisible blade. And all of them knew, without understanding, that something ancient and cunning had entered their world. Amidst the wreckage, Sergeant Cale of the 13th Regiment steadied his trembling hands on his lasgun. His eyes, once sharp and decisive, now darted with the weight of unspoken horrors. "Hold your line," he barked, though even he could hear the tremor of doubt in his voice. Behind him, the ranks of Cadian shock troops pressed forward, each step a defiance of the dread that had taken root. Even the veteran command sergeants, their armor scarred and blackened from decades of service, hesitated under the oppressive silence that had fallen between the explosions. The air was thick with tension, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath and dared not exhale. It was during one such pause that the first signs of manipulation became apparent. Reports crackled through vox grills of officers turning on their own men, orders that contradicted reason, and whispers in the minds of those who could perceive it. Half-formed instructions that led squads into ambushes, strange occurrences in the terrain that should not have been possible, and an unsettling, invisible hand that seemed to rearrange reality itself. Kale's jaw tightened as he realized that the battle was no longer only against orc warbands or the remnants of chaos marauders. Something else was here, something that did not obey the natural laws of war. In the Undercity, civilians cowered in ruined manufactorums, their faces pressed against walls slick with oil and ash. A mother clutched her child, murmuring prayers that blended the litany of the Emperor with desperate invocations of nameless power she could not name, and perhaps did not wish to. Above, shadows twisted unnaturally across the walls, vanishing when one blinked or turned, yet leaving a lingering unease. Kale felt it too, the subtle tightening of fate, the tug of an invisible presence that tested their resolve at every corner, every ruin, every charred street. By nightfall, Cadia was transformed. The once proud fortifications were fractured, the sky a roiling maelstrom of fire and ash, and the people of the planet had become specters of their former selves, driven by fear, loyalty, and the faint spark of defiance that refused to die. And somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the sight of all who remained, the shadow lingered, studying, waiting, and shaping the battlefield with a precision that no mere human mind could fathom. The Imperium's defenders had not yet realized it, but the rules of war had changed. The galaxy itself had been touched by a cunning intelligence that knew not only how to strike, but how to twist the very essence of survival, bending reality to a will they could not yet perceive. The echo of the first chapter of this war resonated in every heart. Fire, despair, and a shadow that whispered of a darkness far greater than any they had ever faced. And from the Undercity, the trenches, and the scorched streets, a single question pulsed like a heartbeat through every mind. What being could wield such impossible power, and why had it chosen Cadia first? The answers, if they existed, waited beyond the next horizon, beyond the burning sky, and in the silence between the stars. By the second dawn, the whispers had taken shape. Cadia's vox grills crackled with static-laden reports, each fragment of sound carrying the same unnameable disquiet. Officers spoke of orders that made no sense, regiments redirected into ambushes, supply lines vanishing as if erased from reality. In the command bunkers, data slates flickered with indecipherable codes and corrupted logs, messages that seemed written in familiar script but carried alien intention. The Adeptus Administratum's own scribes muttered prayers as they tried to make sense of it. Every transmission felt like a lie, every signal a trap, and every voice on the Vox a potential agent of unseen forces. The notion of betrayal, once a rare stain on Cadia's disciplined rigor, had become endemic, an infection seeping through the ranks like a slow poison. Captain Arlen of the 5th Shock Regiment paced the reinforced floors of his command chamber, the soft clatter of his boots echoing across the cavernous interior. His eyes, sharpened by decades of service, darted between data slates alive with chaotic interference. "Reports are conflicting," he said, voice low and controlled, yet taut with tension. "Squads report seeing shadows where none should be. Men are disappearing. Orders are changing mid-transmission. What is this?" The interrogatives hung in the air, unanswered, and Arlen could feel the weight of doubt pressing down, unrelenting. Around him, his aides avoided direct eye contact, all silently acknowledging the same grim truth. The enemy was no longer solely orc or chaos, but something subtler, more insidious, and infinitely patient. In the hive sectors, civilians fared no better. Data slates broadcast fragmented warnings of shifting loyalties among local governors. Vox sentiments painted the world in a haze of suspicion. each broadcast dissected for hidden meanings, each rumor tested against the frail scaffolding of remaining authority. Families whispered in shadowed corners, unsure whether to believe the official proclamations or the terrifying rumors of a shadowy figure who could twist thought itself. The line between friend and foe blurred with every misdirected order, every sudden disappearance, every unexpected betrayal. No one knew whether the messages were true, false, or a cruel mixture of both, a trap that tested faith as effectively as bolter fire tested flesh. Lieutenant Saren, stationed at a peripheral bastion, observed the first cracks in human obedience firsthand. Two sergeants argued over conflicting orders, each insisting that the other had been compromised. Their voices rose, strained and harsh, carrying through corridors lined with the smoke of promethium flares. When Saren approached, both men turned their weapons toward him instinctively, their minds frayed by the subtle manipulations that had begun to worm into their reasoning. He could feel it too, a cold presence brushing against his thoughts, nudging, suggesting, and shaping impulses without words. Somewhere beyond sight, beyond comprehension, a mind was weaving the battlefield as though it were a loom, threading doubt and chaos into every decision, every hesitation, every heartbeat. And yet, amidst the fear, small acts of defiance persisted. Soldiers whispered liturgies under their breath, prayed to the Emperor in ragged voices, and kept their eyes on one another as anchors in the growing storm of doubt. Messages intercepted and deciphered became a form of warfare in itself, each fragment of truth a weapon against the invisible hand that sought to unravel Cadia from within. Even the simplest gestures, hand signals, glance exchanges, the steadying touch on a shoulder, were fraught with meaning, as if each person knew that trust, fragile as it was, might be the only armor left against the encroaching corruption of perception. By the third day, the psychological siege had reached its zenith. Platoons turned on each other in misjudged panic, supplies disappeared into phantom convoys and rumors of impossible sightings, soldiers vanishing only to appear in enemy lines, civilians predicting strikes before they occurred, became indistinguishable from fact. No one could tell whether these events were real or imagined, whether they were acts of sabotage, sorcery, or some alien design beyond comprehension. Cadia, once the bedrock of human resilience, now teetered on the knife edge of chaos. And always in the quiet moments between explosions, between frantic orders and static-laden vox calls, a single unyielding presence watched, silent and calculating, shaping minds, bending reality, and turning the trust of humanity into its own weapon. The day ended with a profound unease. Soldiers huddled in ruined bunkers, eyes darting to shadows that might not exist, minds replaying orders that seemed to shift like sand. Every data slate carried potential deceit. Every voice on the Vox was suspect. Arlen knew that by the time they understood the nature of their enemy, the damage might already be irrevocable. And somewhere in the silence beyond the horizon, the shadow moved on, unseen but unmistakable, orchestrating betrayal as easily as breathing, and leaving Cadia to wonder not if they would survive, but if they could ever trust themselves again. Beneath Cadia's fractured surface, the Undercity writhed like a living wound. Its tunnels, carved into the bedrock centuries ago, now echoed with the constant drip of water, the scrape of scavengers' claws, and the whispered prayers of those who had nowhere else to turn. The air was thick, laden with smoke, rot, and the metallic tang of blood that seeped from the surface above. Here, survival was not measured in victories or honors, but in each breath drawn without succumbing to the suffocating despair. Every step through the soot-choked corridors reminded inhabitants that the Imperium's grandeur above ground was a fragile veneer. Below, there was only hunger, fear, and the faintest glimmers of hope. Families huddled in the shadows of ruined manufactorums, scavenging what little promethium they could find to light the dark. Children with hollow eyes learned quickly the rules of the Undercity. Stay silent, stay invisible, and do not trust the strangers who move through the tunnels with quiet, purposeful steps. Amid the chaos, gangs of scavengers, hardened by starvation and neglect, preyed on the weak, enforcing their own brutal order in the absence of law. Even these microcosms of survival, however, were under the shadow of something greater, a presence that seemed to reach into minds as effortlessly as it moved through walls. It was here that Sidious influence, subtle but unmistakable, began to weave itself into the fabric of human frailty. In one particularly ruined sector, a group of Skidara scouts had descended to investigate anomalies reported by the Mechanicum. Their servitor-laden flanks glowed with faint red eyes as they moved with preternatural precision, scanning walls that twisted unnaturally, as if the Undercity itself had been reshaped by unseen hands. Tech priests muttered prayers to the Omnissiah, attempting to rationalize the impossible. Data slates flickered with corrupted schematics, energy readings spiked in ways that defied explanation. One scout, a young acolyte named Volleys, felt a presence press against his mind, a whisper that promised knowledge beyond comprehension, power beyond loyalty. He recoiled instinctively, realizing that even the machine god's guidance seemed inadequate in the face of this intrusion. Amid the chaos, civilians persisted, their resilience a fragile counterpoint to the despair. Mothers traded scraps for water, elders guided children through forgotten passages, and small groups of militias formed from scavenger bands, combining instinct with the faint remnants of tactical discipline. Yet the longer they dwelled in the shadows, the more the Undercity itself seemed to conspire against them. Walls shifted, corridors looped impossibly, and the very air hummed with anticipation, as if the tunnels had become a labyrinth designed not merely to conceal, but to manipulate, to challenge, and perhaps even to punish. Whispers of impossible phenomena spread from mouth to mouth. Citizens spoke of figures who moved faster than thought, who could appear and vanish without trace, bending fear and loyalty with a subtle gesture. Some claimed these figures were messengers of the Emperor, others suggested Xeno's trickery, and a few dared whisper the forbidden name, Sidious. Whatever truth existed was hidden beneath layers of perception, rumor, and fear. Those who encountered these shadows returned changed, confused, hesitant, and occasionally inspired by flashes of insight that could mean salvation or doom. The Undercity's nights were a test of nerve and sanity. Fires burned in shallow pits, throwing grotesque shadows against the walls, while rats, mutated by prolonged exposure to chemical runoff, scuttled across stone floors. The cries of the starving and wounded intertwined with the distant roar of bombardments from above, a reminder that the surface world's conflict was only a heartbeat away. Those who had survived so far had learned to navigate by instinct, moving as phantoms through corridors thick with mist and memory, ever wary of the forces that were neither wholly visible nor fully understood. As the days passed, the line between predator and prey, human and shadow, began to blur. The presence above, subtle yet omnipresent, reached into the Undercity, testing limits and bending loyalties. Skidara and scavengers alike felt the pressure, the tug of something that could manipulate not just flesh and circumstance, but thought itself. And in those rare, quiet moments when the Undercity seemed to breathe with a life of its own, every inhabitant, from the hardened militia to the trembling child, understood instinctively that they were participants in a far larger design. The galaxy's fate, though incomprehensible from their narrow tunnels, pressed upon them, and their survival, fragile, fleeting, and miraculous, was now inseparable from the unseen hand that played the world above like a symphony of shadows. By the time the surface fires cast long, red streaks into the Undercity, Cadia's people had begun to realize that their struggle was more than survival. It was resistance against a force that could twist reality itself, and the Undercity, for all its decay and death, had become both sanctuary and crucible, shaping human will under impossible pressure. The shadow that lingered above ground now pressed below, unseen yet undeniable, and all who lived beneath Cadia's ruins knew that the coming days would demand courage and cunning that few could summon, and even fewer could sustain. Beyond the surface turmoil of Cadia, beyond shattered cities and suffocating undercities, the imperceptible hum of the warp stirred. It was a vibration that could not be felt with flesh, but with the mind, a resonance that tugged at the edges of consciousness, whispering possibilities and threats alike. Psychers stationed across the sector felt it first, flickers of visions, fragmented premonitions that coalesced into fleeting glimpses of an entity moving through the Imperium as if it were a chessboard. None could name it, yet all knew instinctively that the pattern was deliberate, intelligent, and alien to both the Emperor's will and the natural currents of the warp. Even sanctioned astropaths and inquisitorial seers hesitated to speak what they perceived, fearing that nomming it could invite doom as easily as understanding. Within the confines of a forward Astartes outpost, Brother Captain Marius stood in silent meditation, the hum of his power armor attuned to the subtle resonance of the immaterium. His mind, disciplined and trained beyond mortal capacity, picked apart threads of the warp, seeking clarity. There were anomalies, folds in reality, whispers that suggested events before they occurred, and a pervasive dissonance that turned thought inward. His brethren felt it too, a pressure in the skull, a tugging at memory and reason, the impression of a will that observed them not as soldiers, but as components in a game beyond comprehension. And through it all, a question gnawed at Marius. Was this a weapon of chaos or something else entirely? The rumors traveled faster than any shuttle or transmission. Inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus debated the implications in echoing chambers of gray stone, vox grills alive with fragmented reports from multiple worlds. Some believed the entity to be a rogue Xenos with sorcerous capabilities beyond the bounds of known races. Others whispered the unspeakable, that a being from another galaxy, one capable of bending minds and matter alike, had crossed into the Imperium's reach, testing humanity as both adversary and study. Each theory, however, lacked certainty, and certainty had become a luxury in short supply. Even high-ranking officials could not discern reality from rumor, and rumor itself seemed to shift, reacting to observation as if aware. Amid this growing tension, psychers stationed at observation stations described visions that defied understanding. One reported Cadia's entire surface folding inward, rivers of molten promethium flowing upward into orbit. Another described a shadow stretching across the sector, connecting hive worlds, forge worlds, and battle stations in a lattice invisible to ordinary perception. Every vision carried the same implication. A mind of extraordinary cunning had entered the galaxy, and it was capable of altering events in ways that no standard military response could anticipate. The warp itself, usually a volatile mirror of human emotion, seemed to bend around this force, acknowledging a presence that neither invoked chaos nor submitted to the Emperor. Even the silent, calculating Necron tombs responded. Monoliths emitted pulses that shifted in timing, their once predictable awakenings delayed or accelerated for reasons incomprehensible. Orc warbands, normally governed by brutish instinct and the gestalt drive of the WAAGH, displayed strange coordination, moving in patterns that suggested manipulation beyond mere luck. Across the Imperium, evidence accumulated that the galaxy's natural order was being subtly bent, preordained events rewritten, and entire systems subtly guided toward outcomes that served a purpose no mortal mind could yet perceive. In the quiet of a shattered chapel on a distant world, a lone servitor-administered chapel scribe scrawled feverishly across a data slate, recording visions of impossible clarity. "It is neither chaos nor Xenos," the scribes muttered to themselves, voice mechanical yet filled with awe. "It moves between stars, touches minds, predicts choices. It is methodical. It is patient. It is inevitable." And even as these words were written, the scribe's hand trembled, for the thought occurred that no human action, no matter how devout or courageous, could fully anticipate the consequences of such a presence. The echoes through the warp did more than forecast doom. They reshaped strategy, hierarchy, and belief. Commanders began second-guessing orders before they were issued. Soldiers questioned their own motives, seeing shadows in themselves that were not theirs. The Adeptus Mechanicus, ever rigid in doctrine, faced unexplainable anomalies that challenged centuries of understanding. And above it all, the imperceptible figure lingered, observing, calculating, and waiting for the precise alignment of thought, faith, and action that would allow it to strike the Imperium at its most vulnerable. By the end of the chapter, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. Cadia burned, the Undercity struggled, and the warp hummed with the presence of an intelligence that was neither entirely corporeal nor wholly metaphysical. Across space and time, across hive worlds, forge worlds, and battlefields, the question that lingered in every mind capable of perception was the same. What was coming? And could any act of humanity survive the patient designs of a master of shadow and will? On the forge world's orbiting Terra, the air was thick with ionized metal and ozone, and the ceaseless clamor of machine and servitor echoed through endless manufactorums. Skidari patrols moved with mechanical precision, their augmetic limbs whirring, scanning every corner, every conduit, every corridor for anomalies that could compromise production. The Mechanicum's auger arrays flickered with data inconsistencies, irregularities that could not be explained by malfunction, accident, or even sabotage. Tech priests muttered prayers to the Omnissiah, invoking rites hundreds of years old, yet each blessing seemed to yield only further questions. Something in the pattern of industry itself was wrong, subtle but undeniable, a whisper in the cogitators that suggested design beyond comprehension. Within the heart of a massive forge world, Priest Castor leaned over a flickering data slate, his robe streaked with oil and flux. The cogitator displayed fragments of schematics that had been altered overnight, as if some invisible hand had rewritten the logic of machines while the planet slept. "Impossible," Castor whispered, voice thick with awe and fear. Yet the evidence persisted. Servoskulls malfunctioned in inexplicable ways, manufacturing sequences diverged from sacred protocols, and minor skirmishes erupted between Skidari cohorts who could not account for errors in their own coordination. The Omnissiah himself, it seemed, had not foreseen this disruption. Outside, the factories groaned with the effort of sustaining endless production. Promethium refineries spewed black smoke that rose in ribbons to the orbiting skis, while assembly lines of weapons, servitors, and armor hummed with ceaseless activity. Yet even here, the shadow's influence was evident. Conveyors shifted subtly, instruments failed briefly only to resume with altered parameters, and components arrived misaligned in ways that no human or Skidara calculation could anticipate. The tech priests debated whether this was a new strain of corruption, a Xeno's infiltration, or the hand of a force beyond their doctrine. Every explanation fell short, leaving only the gnawing sense that the order of all things, even the rigid precision of the Mechanicum, had been tested. Among the Skidari, there were whispers, half-prayers muttered to the machine god, of visions experienced during long nights of meditation and maintenance. These were brief, fleeting, yet undeniable, figures cloaked in shadow, moving between worlds, touching machinery as though it were flesh. Orders were predicted before they were given, systems optimized beyond known science, and yet always leaving a trace of imperfection, a signature of a mind both alien and cunning. Some tech adepts dared not speak these visions aloud, fearing censure, heresy, or the ridicule of those too rigid in faith to perceive what lay outside doctrine. On Terra itself, the Hive Fabricator observed anomalies in distant forge networks. Data from hundreds of worlds shifted unpredictably, producing readings inconsistent with any known industrial law. The Council of Magi debated what could interfere on such a scale: a chaos warp incursion, a Xeno's entity of vast technological mastery. Or perhaps, whispered one cautious voice, a being that moved between stars, manipulating not for destruction, but for precise design, bending the galaxy itself as if it were a cog in a machine. Even here, the boundaries of the known universe seemed fluid, and for the first time in centuries, the Fabricator General considered that there were forces Terra itself could not control. Yet life, as always, persisted. Skidara maintained patrols, servitors completed tasks with tireless efficiency, and factories continued to churn out the implements of war and survival. But beneath the hum of industry, beneath the prayers to the Omnissiah and the whirring of servolimbs, there was an awareness. The galaxy was being tested, and the tools of humanity's survival could be turned against them in ways that logic could not anticipate. For every cog aligned, for every machine that functioned perfectly, there was an unseen hand, adjusting, nudging, and preparing for the arrival of a presence that did not merely confront the Imperium, but rewrote the terms of its existence. By nightfall, the glow of molten metal bathed the Forge world in unnatural light. And Priestcaster knew instinctively that their vigilance was not enough. Something had arrived, a master of calculation, deception, and power, and it had begun its work, not with armies, but with the subtle twisting of the machines that formed the backbone of the Imperium. A galaxy built on steel, faith, and fire was now a playground for a mind whose intentions could neither be predicted nor fully comprehended. And as the furnaces roared and the cogitators hummed, the shadow above it all lingered, patient, watching, and inevitable. On Terra, beneath the gilded spires and vaulted ceilings of the Imperial Palace, the Adeptus Custodes moved as statues of wrath and vigilance, their golden armor gleaming in the flickering light of sanctified torches. Every step echoed with authority, every motion precise, every gaze unwavering. Yet even these paragons of martial perfection sensed it, the subtle disturbance that ran through the corridors, the unease that the loyal hearts of mortals could not yet name. For centuries they had safeguarded the Golden Throne, the Emperor, and the sanctity of Terra itself, but the shifting currents of the universe whispered of a threat not yet catalogued, one that tested even their immortal discipline. Shield Captain Valerius of the Custodian Guard observed the throne chamber from a distance, his eyes narrowing at an imperceptible anomaly in the air. Servitors and acolytes went about their duties, unaware that something unseen passed between them, bending attention, molding perception. Valerius' senses, honed beyond human measure, detected patterns that seemed impossible, doors closing and opening without reason, shadows stretching across polished floors and vanishing when scrutinized, and the faintest pulse in the warp, subtle but undeniable. His mind, trained to see all threats, struggled to reconcile these phenomena with known imperial law and reason. It was as if the very architecture of Terra itself had become a chessboard, and the pieces moved independently, guided by a hand invisible yet deliberate. Reports from the planetary defense grids were equally disquieting. Remote Vox sensors detected anomalies in routine patrols, squads of the Adeptus Custodes encountering nothing, yet recording footprints that vanished, systems experiencing sudden latency, and communications garbled with interference that defied conventional explanation. Even seasoned commanders found themselves second-guessing orders, and the Golden Warriors began to perceive the first stirrings of unease among those they had protected for centuries. Terra, the heart of the Imperium, was being tested not with bolter fire or siege engines, but with deception and subtle manipulation, and the Custodes, agents of unparalleled discipline, felt the first fissures of uncertainty. In the halls of judgment, inquisitors convened quietly, debating the veracity of emerging reports. Some suggested a rogue psyker, others feared an alien infiltrator capable of mimicking human thought. A few whispered the forbidden possibility of a being that could manipulate minds across space and time, a dark intelligence whose presence was felt rather than seen. None could present proof, yet every testimony carried the same shiver of truth. Perception itself had become unreliable, and the Custodes, guardians of absolute order, were being drawn into a game whose rules they did not yet know. Meanwhile, Shadow Captain Thalric patrolled the palace's outer sanctums, his gilded armor glinting in the dim light of servo torches. Even among the ornamental corridors, his senses detected inconsistencies. An empty hall that seemed to echo with movement, a sudden chill in the air that did not belong, and subtle distortions in his fellow custods' comportment. At moments, it felt as if the very minds of those around him were being nudged toward decisions they had not made, guided by a force outside reason or loyalty. And Valerius, standing near the golden throne itself, realized that even the Emperor's presence offered no defense against such manipulation. Their discipline was tested, their perception challenged, and their certainty of reality suspended. Outside the palace, reports filtered in of sudden anomalies across the imperial capital. Skidara patrols found manufactorums misaligned. Astropaths experienced fragmented visions of futures impossible to reconcile. Vox signals transmitted conflicting orders that sowed subtle chaos among Terra's defenses. All of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. A presence had arrived, not merely to challenge the Imperium's armies, but to bend perception, faith, and strategy alike. The custods, even at the pinnacle of human martial and psychic discipline, were not immune. They could detect, anticipate, and respond to force, but manipulation of thought, of belief, of instinct was beyond even their godlike faculties. By the end of the day, the Golden Guardian stood vigilant, unwavering in appearance, yet each knew that the shadows now creeping through the palace were not of this world, and not of the warp as they understood it. An intelligence moved like a phantom through Terra, touching minds, guiding perceptions, and probing weaknesses with patience that measured in centuries. And in the quiet chambers of the Emperor's palace, even the custods, unshakable, will acknowledged, if only for a fleeting heartbeat, that the Imperium faced a presence that would test it in ways no bolter, no fleet, and no sacrifice could fully prepare them for. The first open acts of the Shadow's influence rippled outward from Cadia, spreading like a contagion across multiple star systems. Orc warlords, normally impulsive and uncoordinated, began to move with uncanny precision, converging on undefended worlds with strategies that suggested a cunning intelligence behind their usual brutality. Necron tomb ships, long dormant in their crypts, stirred unexpectedly, their emergences perfectly timed to intersect with the Imperium's overstretched defenses. Even elements of the Chaos Legions, fractured and unruly after the 13th Black Crusade, were subtly guided into conflicts that seemed both coincidental and orchestrated, as if the entire galaxy were being arranged like pieces on a board. On the front lines, Cadian regiments fought desperately, their disciplined formations strained to breaking. Explosions carved jagged scars into the landscape, fire and promethium smoke mingling with the acrid scent of blood. Amidst the chaos, soldiers reported impossible phenomena, flashes of movement too fast to follow, the sensation of being watched from multiple angles at once, and orders whispered into the mind, contradicting every command they had received. Sergeant Kale, still leading his battered platoon, realized that the enemy was no longer merely physical. It had become mental, pervasive, and omnipresent. Every decision, every hesitation, every heartbeat was being observed and subtly guided toward outcomes he could neither anticipate nor prevent. Captain Arlen, coordinating a counteroffensive from a temporary command post, received fragmented Vox messages from neighboring systems. Entire regiments had been led into ambushes, supply convoys vanished in the void, and yet the reports carried a peculiar precision, a logic that suggested design rather than mere chaos. The Imperium's forces, already stretched thin, found themselves reacting to events that could not be fully predicted, struggling against an enemy that exploited both flesh and mind. Even the most experienced commanders, those who had faced centuries of war, admitted in whispered counsel that they were confronting an intellect capable of orchestrating multi-system campaigns without ever appearing directly on the battlefield. Amid the fires of burning worlds, civilians and militias alike found themselves caught in the pattern. Entire hive clusters were abandoned as local governors, subtly manipulated or outright deceived, evacuated populations into traps, or left them defenseless against orc marauders. The shadow moved like a predator through the galaxy, exploiting not merely the enemy's weaknesses but humanity's own structures, faith, and assumptions. Acts of heroism were punished, sacrifices misdirected, and every attempt at coordinated defense seemed to play into the overarching strategy of a mind far beyond human comprehension. Meanwhile, whispers of the Shadow's influence reached the Adeptus Astartes and inquisitorial factions. Chapters reported mysterious anomalies, squads disappearing only to reappear elsewhere, minds seemingly twisted by suggestions never voiced, and visions of battles unfolding before they occurred. Inquisitors debated feverishly whether this was heresy, a warp-born manipulation, or the handiwork of an intelligence entirely alien. Every hypothesis, however, failed to account for the subtlety and precision of the actions observed. The galaxy itself seemed caught in a pattern too deliberate to be natural, yet too inscrutable to be chaos alone. By the end of the campaign's opening phase, entire systems had been destabilized without a single visible strike from the Shadow itself. Fleets maneuvered with impossible foresight, Orc and Necron forces collided with surgical precision, and Imperial forces were left reeling, fighting battles dictated not by strategy, but by manipulation. Kale, Arlen, and the surviving Cadians understood that the war had shifted fundamentally. No longer was it a contest of arms or numbers. Now it was a contest of perception, will, and the fragile coordination of the Imperium's scattered defenses. The Crusade of Darkness had begun. It was a war waged not merely with weapons or fleets, but with influence, foresight, and deception. Entire worlds became theaters of calculation, and every mortal within them unwitting actors in a drama orchestrated by a hand unseen. And somewhere beyond the perception of those caught in the fire, the Shadow waited, patient, precise, and inexorable, preparing for the next act in a galactic symphony of chaos, manipulation, and power. On Terra, within the vaulted chambers of the Inquisition, the air was thick with incense and tension, the soft murmur of prayers and litanies threading through the shadows. Inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Malleus convened in hushed conference, debating the nature of the presence that now gripped Cadia and far-flung systems alike. Each voice carried conviction, yet each acknowledged the same unnerving truth. The evidence defied the constructs of faith, reason, and known imperial doctrine. Some argued for Xeno's manipulation, others for warp-born machinations. A few whispered the forbidden possibility that the entity transcended both, a dark intellect moving across the stars with a purpose inscrutable and inexorable. High in the sanctum, Archivist Corvin scrolled through data slates that charted the fractures in loyalty, the anomalous disappearances, and the subtly altered orders across multiple sectors. He traced patterns invisible to the ordinary eye, threads connecting Orc incursions, Necron awakenings, and the inexplicable precision of Chaos assaults. Corvin's breath caught as he realized the pattern's subtlety. It was not mindless carnage. Every incident, no matter how devastating, served a design beyond mere destruction. There was an almost artistic geometry to the chaos, a cruel symmetry that suggested a hand so calculating it rivaled the patience of the Emperor himself. Meanwhile, within the sanctified halls of the ecclesiarchy, whispers of doubt began to creep into the hearts of clergy and devout alike. Priests and acolytes questioned reports with a nervous tremor, reluctant to declare heresy, yet unable to reconcile the anomalies with divine providence. Litanies became both shield and confession, prayers repeated mechanically, each syllable a desperate attempt to anchor faith in a reality that wavered beneath an unseen influence. Even sermons delivered in the grand cathedrals carried an undercurrent of fear, as if the orators themselves sensed the creeping shadow that tested belief at its root. Inquisitors dispatched trusted agents to investigate, yet each returned with fragments, not certainty. Civilians reported apparitions, visions of a cloaked figure moving unseen, appearing briefly only to vanish without trace. Soldiers spoke of orders delivered silently to the mind, of decisions predestined by a force beyond comprehension. Attempts to record these anomalies on data slates failed. Machines warped, signals scrambled, and interpretations varied depending on the observer's own biases and fears. Truth became malleable, faith became tentative, and the very act of knowing was burdened with danger. Even among the Adeptus Astartes, veteran commanders confronted uncertainty. Tactical doctrines that had endured millennia faltered when confronted with an enemy whose strategy was woven from perception, manipulation, and foresight. Squads vanished without trace only to reappear in positions dictated by the entity's inscrutable design. Orders became questions, plans became mirrors reflecting shadows, and the custodes themselves, ever disciplined and unyielding, found their certainty of judgment tested. It was not merely the body, the weapon, or the mind that was vulnerable, but the very essence of faith and trust that held the Imperium together. By the chapter's close, Terra itself seemed a crucible of conflicting truths. Inquisitors, priests, and generals alike struggled to distinguish prophecy from rumor, doctrine from deception. Every report, every vision, and every account was colored by doubt, leaving the galaxy's defenders in a state of fragile indecision. And yet, beneath the liturgies, beneath the whispers, beneath the carefully measured prayers, one certainty persisted. The shadow that had entered the Imperium moved with deliberate patience, testing faith, twisting perception, and proving that even the strongest defenses could falter when reality itself became a weapon. The litanies and lies converged, echoing across the vaulted halls, across the stars, across the hearts of all who served. Each syllable, each fragment of rumor, each flicker of uncertainty fed the larger design, preparing the stage for confrontations not merely of armies, but of belief, perception, and the fragile will of humanity. And in that quiet tension, the galaxy waited, suspended, knowing that the next act would demand more than courage. It would demand a reckoning of thought, faith, and truth itself. Deep within the Golden Throne, the Emperor's endless vigil continued, a silent beacon against the tides of darkness that pressed upon the Imperium. The throne's psychic lattice pulsed with a rhythm both eternal and fragile, a cadence that maintained humanity's connection across the stars. Yet even here, in the sanctified heart of Terra, the presence of the shadow was sensed, a subtle dissonance in the astronomicon, an imperceptible tug at the mind that could not be explained by natural fluctuation or the usual strain of centuries-long vigilance. Custodes and tech priests alike observed, uneasy, aware that the Emperor's sight, vast as it was, might not fully encompass the movements of this unseen intelligence. Shield Captain Valerius, stationed in the throne chamber, felt the first ripple of unease as he monitored the psychic emanations. Every pulse, every flicker of energy carried a resonance that suggested interference. Not a breach, not a physical assault, but something more insidious. It was as if a will, patient and unfathomably clever, probed the lattice, testing its integrity, measuring its reach. He conveyed his concerns to the High Fabricator, and though the mechanisms and machinery hummed in apparent compliance, Valerius understood instinctively that what was happening exceeded even the combined expertise of the Custodes and Mechanicum. The shadow's touch was not of flesh, nor of machine, but of perception itself. Across Terra, psychers and astropaths discerned subtle anomalies within the warp. Fluctuations in the astronomicon's signals suggested shifts not born of chaos, nor of natural celestial interference. Rumors whispered in the corridors of the palace spoke of glimpses, visions of battles yet to come, outcomes manipulated before actions were taken, and the impossible notion that the Emperor's perception might be challenged, even tested, by a being of extraordinary cunning. Even the most devout servants of the Golden Throne felt a chill, the recognition that their faith and vigilance were being measured against a mind capable of predicting, anticipating, and reshaping events with meticulous care. High Inquisitor Damaris convened a council with representatives of the Ordo Malleus and Adeptus Custodes to evaluate the threat. Data slates revealed patterns previously dismissed as coincidence. Entire regiments led into traps, fleets maneuvering as though guided by foresight beyond human comprehension, and anomalies in psyker readings that defied explanation. Every observation pointed to the same conclusion. This was not mere war, but a campaign of intelligence, subtle manipulation, and psychological domination. The Emperor's vigilance, for all its vast power, had not yet intercepted the full extent of this threat, and the realization sparked an uneasy tension that resonated throughout the chamber. In the corridors surrounding the Golden Throne, Custodes moved with measured precision, each step a blend of discipline and anticipation. Valerius observed a subtle shift in the palace's shadows, a distortion too faint for ordinary perception yet undeniable to the senses honed over centuries. It was not malevolence in the traditional sense, nor was it overt aggression. It was observation, testing, and calculation. A silent intelligence, patient and meticulous, weighed every action, every decision, every thought. The realization was undeniable. The Imperium's heart, its most sacred nexus, was under scrutiny, and the consequences of failure would echo across countless worlds. By the chapter's close, the vigil itself seemed to respond, the Golden Throne pulsing with unsteady rhythms, as if aware that even its vast power was being probed. Custodes adjusted formations, psychers focused with renewed discipline, and inquisitors revised assessments that had once seemed definitive. And yet, despite their combined vigilance, one thought lingered unshakable in Valerius' mind. The shadow was patient, precise, and beyond conventional reckoning. It did not rush. It did not strike. It waited, and in waiting, it tested the very will and perception of the Imperium itself, setting the stage for a reckoning that would span both mind and matter, faith and strategy, across the burning stars. The galaxy groaned under the weight of conflict and manipulation, systems once secure now fractured, each star world a testament to misjudgment, misdirection, or the subtle hand of the shadow. Cadia, the once unyielding bulwark, lay scarred and smoldering, its surviving regiments scattered across sectors, chasing threads of orders that had been twisted before they were ever spoken. Imperial convoys vanished in hyperspace, fleets misaligned and colliding due to false intelligence, and entire planetary governors enacted policies that seemed rational, yet served only the unseen design. It was not open assault that threatened the Imperium, but a quiet unraveling, the slow unweaving of centuries of order, discipline, and faith. Amid the turmoil, Captain Arlen moved through ruined command centers, Vox Grill crackling with desperate messages from scattered units. Soldiers, fatigued and broken, whispered rumors of impossible sightings, enemy forces appearing where none should exist, allies turning against one another, and whispers in the mind guiding or misguiding decisions. The front lines had become a theater not of direct combat, but of perception, where courage alone could not secure victory. Each action, each choice, was a potential instrument in a larger design, and those who resisted found themselves trapped not by enemy fire, but by circumstance manipulated beyond understanding. In orbit above Terra, battle fleets adjusted in response to conflicting intelligence. Admirals argued over movements dictated by reports that shifted mid-transmission, tactical arrays revealing anomalies that no human calculation could reconcile. The Adeptus Mechanicus observed their own production lines faltering under subtle interference, as if every cog and circuit were subject to the Shadow's will. On worlds nominally under Imperial control, Orc WAAGHs, Necron awakenings, and Chaos incursions seemed synchronized, their outcomes finely tuned to maximize confusion and attrition. No defense, no matter how meticulously planned, remained untouched. Within the Golden Throne itself, Custodes and Psychers noted a subtle distortion of the Astronomicon. The Emperor's psychic beacon, eternal and vast, flickered with an imperceptible irregularity. Shield Captain Valerius observed patterns in the distortions, realizing with growing dread that the shadow was not merely affecting the corporeal Imperium, but probing the psychic heart of human civilization itself. Even the Emperor's unending vigilance was insufficient to counter a mind capable of anticipating, manipulating, and directing events on such a scale. The galaxy's greatest safeguards strained under pressure, and cracks began to appear in the very edifice of order the Imperium relied upon. Amid the chaos, rumors spread like wildfire. Entire hive worlds had been lost without conventional battle. Fleets disappeared only to reappear in positions dictated by an intelligence beyond comprehension, and psychers reported visions of wars that had yet to occur but were unfolding as if preordained. In the undercities of devastated worlds, civilians struggled for survival, sensing, without understanding, that the calamities above were not random. The shadow had become the invisible architect of suffering, testing humanity's resilience, faith, and ingenuity at every turn. By the chapter's end, the Imperium stood fractured, its unity strained by deception, manipulation, and relentless psychological assault. Military victories counted little against the subtle orchestration of fate, and even the most disciplined commanders found themselves reacting rather than directing. Cadia's ruins, Terra's trembling vigilance, and the scattered fleets across the stars were all threads in a tapestry woven by a patient, calculating intelligence. The galaxy had been shattered not by brute force alone, but by a power capable of bending perception, loyalty, and thought itself. And as the stars burned in distant systems, the shadow watched, silent, inexorable, and certain that the ultimate reckoning was still to come. The galaxy's fires burned bright and uneven, worlds fractured under the weight of unrelenting war and manipulation. Across shattered Cadia, scorched hive sectors, and ruined manufactorums, survivors moved like ghosts, their hearts heavy with loss, their eyes haunted by visions of battles that had no clear beginning or end. The shadow that had orchestrated so many crises now revealed in glimpses the full magnitude of its influence. It was no longer merely a phantom presence guiding events. It had become a force that reshaped outcomes, bending armies, machines, and minds to its inscrutable will. To see it was impossible, yet its effects radiated through every decision, every hesitation, every breath of the Imperium. Captain Arlen, hardened by countless campaigns and the ruin of his homeworld, stood atop a ruined command bunker, gazing across a battlefield that seemed suspended between reality and vision. The ground was torn, buildings smoldered, and promethium fires painted the sky in unnatural hues. Yet even amidst this carnage, Arlen could perceive the design. Each clash, each ambush, each misdirected order had been guided as if by an intellect beyond comprehension. Soldiers moved with courage, commanders planned with skill, and yet their efforts were threads woven into a larger tapestry, one that belonged to a mind patient, meticulous, and vast beyond imagining. On Terra, the Golden Throne pulsed with a rhythm strained by centuries yet unbroken, but even its infinite vigilance felt the shadows probing. Shield Captain Valerius and the Custodes observed anomalies in psychic flows, distortions in the Astronomicon that suggested not destruction, but a subtle reordering of thought and perception. Inquisitors and psychers recorded visions of entire campaigns manipulated before they could unfold, battles shaped by foresight, and loyalties tested as if humanity itself were a laboratory for calculating influence. Even the Emperor, eternal and immovable, was challenged, not in strength, but in the subtle terrain of mind and will that the shadow had mastered. Across orbiting Forge worlds, Skidari noted the perfection of misalignment, manufactorums producing with uncanny irregularity, machines that seemed to follow directives never issued, and circuits bending logic as if anticipating command. The Mechanicum's sacred rites were observed, tested, and subtly redirected. High fabricators whispered to one another in corridors lit with molten metal, acknowledging in hushed tones that no doctrine, no prayer, no litany could fully account for this presence. Terra's machines, and the minds that controlled them, were instruments in a symphony conducted by a will that had learned patience over millennia. And still, the shadow did not strike directly. It moved among fleets, armies, and worlds with the elegance of a predator shaping an ecosystem, the cruelty of one who could calculate suffering and gain insight from its distribution. Orcs, Necrons, and Chaos forces collided with almost artistic precision, sowing confusion, attrition, and despair, while leaving humanity's noblest warriors to wrestle with unseen consequences. Heroes rose and fell, entire regiments were lost or misled, and yet through it all, the shadow observed, patient, unhurried, and absolute in its mastery of influence. In the undercities and hives, civilians sensed the final phase of the shadow's design. Their survival depended not only on courage or skill, but on perception, trust, and instinct, the very faculties the entity had been testing for cycles of months, perhaps years. Children who had grown in the ruins of manufactorums now navigated the labyrinth of chaos with uncanny awareness. Militia leaders acted with insight drawn from glimpses of possible outcomes. Soldiers adapted in ways that reflected both human resilience and the subtle shaping of thought the shadow had imposed. Humanity itself, fragile yet enduring, was both weapon and trial in the unfolding apotheosis. By the chapter's end, the galaxy held its breath. The shadow, master of influence and foresight, had transformed the Imperium's struggle into an arena of thought, will, and consequence. Battles were no longer merely fought with bolter and blade, but in the recesses of perception and the fragile architecture of faith. And yet, even as the full extent of its power became apparent, one truth remained immutable: the Imperium endured. Its fleets still moved, its regiments still fought, its psychers still prayed, and its custodes still guarded the golden throne. The shadow's apotheosis had tested humanity to the edge of comprehension, but it had also revealed the persistent flame of will, courage, and faith that no force, however cunning, could wholly extinguish. In the silence following the final storms, Arlen, Valerius, and countless unseen soldiers across the stars understood a singular, undeniable truth. The galaxy had been changed, its battles reshaped, and its perceptions forever tested. Yet within that crucible of shadows and fire, humanity's spirit persisted, unbroken, watching, learning, and surviving, ready to endure whatever else the void might bring.